On the 26th of September 2002, the passenger ferry Joola set off on its weekly trip from the port of Ziguinchor in southern Senegal, heading for the capital port city of Dakar. She never arrived. What should have been a routine overnight passage ended up being the second worst ferry disaster of all time, a tragedy which led to the Joola becoming known as Africa's Titanic. Built in 1990 by the German firm Ingo Schleuter, the merchant vessel Joola was designed to make the 300-mile return journey between South and North Senegal, from the river town of Ziguinchor in southern Casamance region to the capital Dakar in the north. She was a stern-loading roll-on, roll-off ferry with a total passenger capacity of 580 and room for 35 cars. To navigate the waters of the Casamance River, she was designed with a flat bottom to give her a very shallow draft. With a length of 261 foot and a beam of 40 foot, she wasn't a particularly large vessel, but she was sturdy and well built, a workhorse who spent the first decade of her working life shuttling goods, vehicles, cargo and passengers between the two ports. As you can see from the map, the geography of Senegal is odd in that it almost completely encompasses another country, the Gambia, in its central region. This made the ferry important to many people in the southern Casamance region of Senegal. Casamance is one of the most fertile agricultural parts of Senegal, and people needed the ferry to transport their produce to sell in the capital. Without this sea route, they had to undertake a perilous 2-day overland journey around the Gambia to reach Dakar, or travel directly through the Gambia, which was also difficult. Increased security at border crossings had brought long delays, and having to pay bribes to the Gambian border officials and tolls to cross the river meant that this route was out of the question for many of the poorer residents of the Casamance region. The Joola was out of operation for a year from August 2001, undergoing maintenance and having her port engine replaced. During this time, the government was constantly under pressure to have the ship back in service. By the end of the summer of 2002, she was returned to service, but making only one return trip per week instead of the usual 2. This reduced workload was in order to give time for the new port engine to be run in properly. However, this single weekly trip led to a huge demand for tickets, a demand which surged at the end of the holiday season. On September the 26th, 2002, the Joola began loading passengers, cargo and crew for what was going to be her final voyage. Although she had a capacity of only 580 passengers and crew, over 1,000 tickets had been sold for the trip. Add on to that the number of children under 5 who didn't need a ticket, and the many stowaways who would hop onto the boat for a token bribe, and it's easy to imagine that the estimated figure of 1,800 people on board is probably accurate. Eyewitnesses at the quay reported that the Joola was already listing heavily to port by the time that she left Ziguinchor at 1:30 p.m. Indeed, it's reported that some would-be passengers did not board the ferry at all, as she was listing so heavily to one side. The Joola made one more stop at the small island of Karabani, where around another 200 passengers boarded the already overcrowded ship. As the Joola headed out to the open sea, it's estimated that she had around 2,000 people on board. It was a hot night, and many people opted to sleep up on the open top deck. Many other passengers, however, stayed on the lower decks, as there was a live band playing and there was much dancing and merriment on board. The last communication from the crew came at around 10 p.m, reporting no problems and calm seas. However, at around 11 p.m, the ship, now some 23 miles off the coast of the Gambia and heading north, ran into a freak squall. This mini-storm brought high winds, rain and rough waves. On board the Joola, untethered cargo began to slide around, moving gradually down to the lowest side of the ship and increasing her list to port side. As waves began sloshing onto the cargo deck, the ship's lighting shorted out, plunging the ferry into darkness. The Joola was hopelessly top-heavy, and the flat bottom of the boat did nothing to help keep the ship upright. Disaster was inevitable. Just 5 minutes after encountering the storm, the Joola rolled over to port and capsized. From the few eyewitness reports that we have, it seems that many of the passengers survived the initial capsize, but were doomed to drown in the sea as little in the way of rescue was forthcoming. After the storm had passed, some local fishermen who were close by were able to pluck some survivors from the water. Other passengers who had been thrown into the sea were able to scramble onto the upturned hull to await rescue. All the while, banging, shouts and screams could be heard emanating from the interior of the Joola as those still trapped inside clamoured for rescue. Only one life raft was deployed, and it remained floating listlessly at the side of the upturned hull. The rescue response coordinated by the authorities was incredibly slow to get started. Relatives waiting on the quayside in Dakar were still being told at 8 o'clock the following morning that the vessel was running late, but to be patient, it will be here soon. This was a full 9 hours after the Joola had capsized. One father, waiting on the quay to pick up his 3 sons, only found out that the ferry had sunk by hearing a radio news report on the 10 o'clock news. None of his children had survived. Rescue vessels finally arrived on scene by around 11 a.m. and began to retrieve what few survivors remained, mostly those who were clinging to the still floating hull. The last survivor was a 15-year-old boy who was lifted off at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He later confirmed that screams could still be heard coming from inside the Joola as he was winched off the upturned hull. The rescue vessels had no means of reaching the trapped survivors, but their plight was soon ended. The Joola sank shortly afterwards, taking all those still alive down with her. The fate of those left on board doesn't even bear thinking about. The numbers make for harrowing reading. From the estimated 2,000 people who were on board the Joola, there were only 64 survivors, 63 men and 1 pregnant woman. The official accepted figure for the number of lives lost is 1,863, and this made the sinking of the Joola the second worst maritime disaster of all time. Some in Senegal believe the actual death toll to be well over 2,000, but this figure has never been confirmed.